Chapter 1. The Origins of Music in Prehistory. Music is one of the oldest forms of expression of mankind. Long before there were written traditions or sophisticated instruments, people produced sounds, rhythms, and songs that were closely related to rituals, work, and community. The beginnings of music go back deep into prehistory and are closely linked to the development of language, religion, and social life. Archaeological finds, comparative musicology, and the study of today's primitive peoples give us clues as to what these early musical forms might have looked like. The human body was probably the first instrument. Clapping, stomping, and rhythmic movements served not only as an expression of joy or excitement, but also for coordination within a group. Such simple rhythms helped with communal work, for example, hunting, building huts, or grinding grain. Music had a practical function. It structured actions, promoted cohesion, and facilitated the course of everyday activities. The voice also played a central role from the beginning. Originally, it was probably shouts, screams, and simple melodies that served as signals. But soon, more complex forms of singing developed. These first songs were probably closely related to religious or spiritual ideas. Even in early times, people saw supernatural forces at work in natural phenomena such as thunder, wind, or birdsong. By imitating these sounds or translating them into chants, they created a bridge between themselves and the invisible world. Archaeological finds prove that musical instruments existed tens of thousands of years ago. Particularly famous are the bone flutes from the Swabian Alb, which are dated to an age of around 40,000 years. They are made of bones of birds or mammoths and have neatly drilled holes that made it possible to produce sound in a targeted manner. These flutes show that music in the Paleolithic age was not just a spontaneous sound, but a deliberately designed art form that was probably played at rituals or festivals. In addition to flutes, there were probably simple drums, rattles, and strapping instruments. Drums could be made of animal skins stretched over wooden frames, while rattles were made of dried gourds or bones filled with pebbles or seeds. Such instruments can still be observed today in indigenous cultures, which often use similar tools for religious ceremonies or dances. The use of rhythm instruments illustrates the importance of repetition and structure. Music was not only sound, but also movement, dance, and ritual. An important aspect of early music was its social function. It connected people with each other and helped to create identity. In small hunter-gatherer groups, music was a means of experience in community. Singing or drumming together strengthened a sense of togetherness and facilitated communication. The passing on of knowledge and stories also often took place through song forms, long before writing existed. Music was a reminder, entertainment, and religious practice at the same time. In addition, music had a psychological and emotional dimension. It could calm down, encourage, or express fear. Music played a central role, especially in rites of passage, such as births, hunts, or funerals. It gave these moments a solemn character and connected those involved with a higher order. In this respect, music was more than mere entertainment from the very beginning. It was a medium between man and the world, between this world and the hereafter. A fascinating indication of the early importance of music is the fact that it occurs universally. Whether in Africa, Asia, Europe, or America, all cultures know forms of music, and almost all of them associate them with rituals, work, and community. This universality speaks for the fact that music is deeply anchored in the human being. Some scholars even suspect that music was a precursor to language. Melodic calls may have helped convey emotional content long before complex grammatical structures were developed. Nature also played a major role in early musical history. The singing of birds, the sound of the water, or the howling of the wind inspired people to imitate these sounds or to integrate them into their songs. In many early cultures, music was considered something given by gods or nature spirits. Musicians and shamans therefore occupied a special position. They were considered mediators between humans and supernatural powers. Their music was supposed to bring healing, protection, or happiness. The development of music in prehistory cannot be reconstructed exactly, but its basic features are recognizable. Rhythm, sound, and song formed a unity with movement, ritual, and community. Music was not an isolated art form, but was closely intertwined with people's entire lives. It was used for work, communication, religion, and entertainment. In this way, the music of prehistory laid the foundation for everything that followed. Over thousands of years, complex systems of scales, instruments, and music theories have emerged from simple drums, flutes, and chants. But the core remained the same. Music was and is an expression of the human need for connection, with nature, with fellow human beings, and with the invisible.
Chapter 2. Music in Early Advanced Civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China. With the transition from the Paleolithic to sedentary life in the Neolithic and the emergence of the first advanced civilizations, music also took on new forms. While in prehistory music was primarily in the context of ritual, community, and imitation of nature, it now developed into an integral part of complex societies. Music was institutionalized, given religious, political, and representative functions, and was increasingly associated with power and culture. These developments can be observed especially in the early centers of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris, which is considered the cradle of civilization, music was deeply intertwined with religion and society. Archaeological finds prove that Sumerians and Babylonians had a rich musical culture as early as 3000 BC. The most famous instruments were lyres and harps, which were made of wood and often decorated with elaborate decorations. In particular, the famous Lyre of Yor, which was found in the Royal Cemetery of Yor, shows that music played an important role in cult and rule. The lyre was not only a musical instrument, but also a symbol of status and religious significance. In Mesopotamia, music had above all a cultic function. It accompanied sacrificial acts in the temples, was played in honor of the gods, and served as a medium between people and the divine world. Priest musicians were highly respected personalities, and their songs were considered effective means of appeasing the gods. In addition, music was also part of festivals and celebrations. Hymns that have been handed down on clay tablets are among the oldest notated musical works of mankind. Although the signs are only rudimentarily understandable as notation, they show that attempts were made early on to record music in writing. Egypt also developed a high-quality musical culture that was closely linked to religion, court life, and everyday culture. Music was omnipresent at religious ceremonies in the temple, at processions in honor of the gods, in the palaces of the pharaohs, as well as at festivals of the common people. Illustrations on wall paintings show musicians with harps, flutes, drums, and sistra, a ritual rattle instrument that played an important role in the worship of the goddess Hathor. In contrast to Mesopotamia, music in Egypt was not only reserved for priests and rulers, but also part of social life. Musicians performed at festivals, banquets, and even funerals. Women were strongly represented in Egyptian musical culture, especially as singers and dancers. Music was closely linked to dance in Egypt, and often the two formed an inseparable unit. Here, too, music had a magical and religious meaning. It was believed that it had healing powers and was able to maintain the balance of the world. Certain instruments were considered sacred, and their sounds were supposed to keep chaos and evil forces away. Music was thus not only art, but also a form of spiritual practice that was deeply embedded in everyday life. While Mesopotamia and Egypt developed music primarily in cultic and social contexts, China formed a musical culture that was strongly philosophical and cosmological. As early as the second millennium BC, the Chinese regarded music as a mirror of the cosmic order. The philosopher Confucius, 551 through 479 BC, later formulated the idea that music not only provides pleasure, but also shapes human morality and ensures harmony in the state. Chinese musical culture developed closely in connection with the pentatonic tonal system, which is based on 5 tones and is still widespread in many Asian musical cultures today. Music was an expression of cosmic harmony. Each pitch was connected to certain elements, seasons, and cardinal directions. Thus, music was not just sound, but part of a comprehensive worldview that reflected order and balance in society. Musical instruments were also highly developed in China. Particularly well known are the bianzong, sets of bronze bells played in solemn ceremonies, and the stringed instrument guqin, a zither that was considered an instrument of scholars. While in Mesopotamia and Egypt music had a sacred and festive dimension, in China it was also a form of intellectual and moral practice. Music served to educate people and keep the state in harmony. What the early advanced civilizations had in common was that music was always more than mere entertainment. It was an expression of power, religion, and order. Its structured festivals, accompanied rituals, served as a medium between humans and gods and reflected the values of the respective culture. In these societies, music was not only an artistic discipline, but part of religious and political life. The early advanced civilizations thus laid the foundation for many musical traditions that continue to have an impact today. The Mesopotamian hymns mark the beginning of written notation. The Egyptian connection between music and dance still shapes our ideas of celebration and ritual. And the Chinese idea of music as an expression of cosmic harmony continues to influence Asian musical culture to this day. Thus, even in the beginnings of civilization, it became clear that music is universal and yet takes on its own forms in every culture. It connects people across space and time, while at the same time expressing the specific values and worldviews of a society.
Chapter 3. Music in Ancient Greece, Theory and Practice. Ancient Greece occupies a key position in the history of music. Not only did a rich musical practice emerge here, but also the first systematic theory that regarded music as an independent science. Many terms, concepts, and ideas that are still used in music theory today have their origins in Greek antiquity. At the same time, music was an integral part of social, religious, and cultural life and shaped philosophy, poetry, and education in a unique way. Music was omnipresent in Greece. She accompanied religious ceremonies, festivals, theater performances, and sports competitions. At the Olympic Games, hymns and songs were played in honor of the gods. Choirs and instrumental accompaniment were indispensable in the theaters. And music and singing played a central role in the symposia, the convivial drinking bouts of the upper class. It was not only entertainment, but also an expression of education, status, and spiritual connection with the gods. One of the most important instruments was the lyre, a stringed instrument closely associated with the god Apollo. It was considered a symbol of harmony, moderation, and spiritual order. Another popular instrument was the kithara, a larger and more professional form of lyre played by trained musicians. The wind instrument aulos, a double reed flute, was also widespread, often in connection with Dionysus, the god of intoxication and ecstasy. While the lyre stood for prudence and order, the aulos was considered an expression of passionate and ecstatic feelings. This alone shows the contrast between two poles of Greek culture, measure and passion, Apollonian and Dionysian. The Greeks closely associated music with upbringing and education. According to her idea, music shaped the character of man. Even children learned to play the lyre and sing simple songs. Music was considered a means of moral and intellectual education. It was not only supposed to bring joy, but also to promote virtue and harmony in people. This idea is reflected in the writings of philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. Plato saw music as a powerful tool for shaping the soul. In his work Politeia, he wrote that certain keys, the Greeks called them harmonies or modes, have different effects on character. Some modes promoted bravery, others led to softness and inertia. Plato therefore pleaded for a strict selection of musical forms in the state in order to educate citizens. Aristotle developed these thoughts further and spoke of catharsis, the purifying effect of music on the soul. Music could therefore evoke emotions, but also order and purify. One of the most important instruments was the lyre, a stringed instrument closely associated with the god Apollo. It was considered a symbol of harmony, moderation, and spiritual order. Another popular instrument was the kithara, a larger and more professional form of lyre played by trained musicians. The wind instrument aulos, a double reed flute, was also widespread, often in connection with Dionysus, the god of intoxication and ecstasy. While the lyre stood for prudence and order, the aulos was considered an expression of passionate and ecstatic feelings. This alone shows the contrast between two poles of Greek culture, measure and passion, Apollonian and Dionysian. The Greeks closely associated music with upbringing and education. According to her idea, music shaped the character of man. Even children learned to play the lyre and sing simple songs. Music was considered a means of moral and intellectual education. It was not only supposed to bring joy, but also to promote virtue and harmony in people. This idea is reflected in the writings of philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. Plato saw music as a powerful tool for shaping the soul. In his work Politeia, he wrote that certain keys, the Greeks called them harmonies or modes, have different effects on character. Some modes promoted bravery, others led to softness and inertia. Plato therefore pleaded for a strict selection of musical forms in the state in order to educate citizens. Aristotle developed these thoughts further and spoke of catharsis, the purifying effect of music on the soul. Music could therefore evoke emotions, but also order and purify. Mathematical considerations also played an important role. The philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras discovered that musical intervals are based on simple numerical ratios. When a string was split in certain ratios, such as 2:1 for the octave or 3:2 for the fifth, harmonic sounds resulted. This discovery led to the idea that music is an expression of a cosmic order, the so-called harmony of the spheres. According to this idea, the celestial bodies also produced invisible sounds that were in perfect harmony with each other. Music was thus not only an art, but also a science that reflected the structure of the cosmos. In the everyday life of the Greeks, music had a variety of functions. In the theaters, which were central places of public life, music was part of the basic equipment. Tragedies and comedies were accompanied by choirs that sang and danced. Music enhanced the emotional impact of the dramas and helped structure the plot. Music also played an indispensable role in religious cults. Hymns in honor of the gods, processional songs, and sacrificial songs connected the faithful with the divine. In addition, music was also part of the military. When marching and fighting, rhythms ensured order and cohesion. The aulos flutes often accompanied the army into battle and set the beat for the hoplites. Thus, music also fulfilled a practical, community-building function here. The Greeks also developed the first forms of music notation. Although only a few fragments have survived, they show that sounds were represented with special characters that stood above the text. This early notation made it possible to record melodies even if it wasn't as detailed as our musical notation today. Some of these fragments, such as the Seikilos epitaph from the 1st century AD, are considered to be the oldest completely preserved pieces of music in the world. The significance of Greek music extends far beyond antiquity. Their ideas of harmony, ethos, and mathematical order shaped music theory into the Middle Ages and modern times. Terms such as scale, interval, or mode go directly back to Greek concepts. The idea that music has a morally and emotionally formative effect also lives on in pedagogical concepts to this day. Thus, music in ancient Greece was much more than an accompaniment to festivals and rituals. It was an integral part of culture, linked to religion, philosophy, and science. It reflected the belief in order, harmony, and moderation, but also in passion and ecstasy. It combined art and science, theory and practice, every day and the cosmos. In this way, Greek antiquity laid the foundations for many concepts that were to determine the history of music for thousands of years. Chapter 4. Music in Ancient Rome, Entertainment and Military Music. Ancient Rome adopted many of the cultural achievements of the Greeks, including music. But while the Greeks saw music as part of philosophy, education, and cosmic order, in the Roman Empire it had a much more pragmatic and often spectacular character. Music here was mainly used for entertainment, representation, and military use. It was less an object of theoretical reflection than an integral part of public and private life, embedded in games, festivals, and the army. Music was omnipresent in Roman society. At the famous gladiator games in the Colosseum, trumpets, horns, and drums sounded, which accompanied the course of the fights and heated up the mood in the audience. Music added to the drama of the action, signaled the beginning or end of a fight, and made the games a spectacle not only visually but also acoustically. Music also played a major role in chariot races in the Circus Maximus. Trumpet blasts signaled the start, and rhythmic sounds accompanied the race. In addition to these public games, music was also an integral part of religious festivals and processions. Priests accompanied sacrificial acts with songs, and flutes or zithers sounded in honor of the gods. The Romans adopted many of these traditions from the Etruscans and Greeks, but adapted them to their own needs. Music played a role especially in the imperial cults. Hymns and fanfares were intended to underline the power and divinity of the ruler. A special area was military music. Rome had a highly developed system of musical signals that ensured order and discipline in the army. Instruments such as the tuba, a long trumpet, the cornu, a large circular horn, and the bucina, a snail-shaped wind instrument, were used to transmit commands. Since in battle the shouts of the soldiers and the noise of the battle made any verbal communication impossible, clear acoustic signals were vital. They could be used to give the marching order, signal the attack, or initiate the retreat. The Roman army would hardly have been so disciplined and effective without its music. In the private sphere, music was an integral part of banquets and conviviality. Wealthy Romans had musicians perform at their banquets who played flutes, kithars, or harps. Singers and dancers performed as entertainers and provided distraction. Music was considered less of a moral or educational force than a luxury good and a symbol of prosperity. Those who employed musicians at their festivals showed their wealth and their closeness to Greek culture. Music also played a central role in the theater. In contrast to the Greek tragedies, the focus in Roman theater was on entertainment. Comedies, pantomimes, and mimes were almost always accompanied by music. Especially pantomime, a kind of dance theater, was unthinkable without music. Flutes, drums, and cymbals set the rhythm for the actors' movements and enhanced the effect on the audience. Theoretically, Rome developed little of its own compared to Greece. The Romans largely adopted Greek music theory without significantly developing it. Terms such as harmony, scale, or ethos were retained, but were rarely philosophically deepened. Music was considered less a science and more a practical art. The relationship to music was also often ambivalent. While it was valued as an indispensable part of everyday life, it was also viewed with skepticism when it was associated with luxury, excess, or effeminacy. Some conservative Romans warned that too much music could weaken the discipline of youth. The role of the Christian communities that emerged in the late Roman Empire is particularly exciting. Early on, Christians used music to spread their message and shape their worship services. They developed simple chants that would later lead to Gregorian chant. In contrast to the magnificent musical productions of the imperial court, the early Christians relied on simplicity and communal singing. In doing so, they laid the foundation for a new sacred musical culture that was to shape the Middle Ages. Roman music is known to us today only in fragments. Although illustrations of instruments, literary reports, and archaeological finds have survived, written notations are extremely rare. Nevertheless, a vivid picture can be drawn. Music in Rome was closely linked to spectacle, power, and community. It had less ambition to shape the soul than to shape the moment, be it in the theater, in the circus, in the temple, or in the camp. So it can be said that music in ancient Rome was above all functional. It served for entertainment, representation, and organization. It reflected the values of a culture based on power, order, and splendor. While Greece laid the foundations of music theory, Rome brought music into the world of the masses, the spectacle, and the military. In doing so, it created a new dimension of musical practice, the aftermath of which was to reach into the European culture of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Chapter 5. Music in Early Christianity. Gregorian Chant. With the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, the role of music changed fundamentally. While in pagan antiquity, music was closely associated with spectacle, festivals, and secular entertainment, it now gained a new spiritual dimension. Music became an instrument of worship, a bridge between man and God. Even in the earliest Christian communities, singing played a central role, and over centuries it developed into Gregorian chant, a form of monophonic liturgical singing that became the basis of Western church music. The first Christians were ambivalent in their attitude to music. On the one hand, people were critical of the magnificent music of the Roman world. Many church fathers saw elaborate instrument sounds and exuberant festive music as a danger to the purity of the faith. According to the Christian understanding, music was not allowed to serve sensual seduction, but should only carry the word of God. On the other hand, people knew about the power of singing to move people and create community. Even in the writings of the New Testament, there are references to Christians singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. This congregational singing was originally simple. Psalms from the Old Testament were sung, often in simple, recitative form. The singing served the proclamation, was part of the prayer, and at the same time an expression of the unity of the faithful. Since many parishioners could not read, recurring melodies and lyrics helped to anchor the message in the memory. Music was therefore not only an expression of faith, but also a pedagogical tool. With the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, a liturgical tradition of its own began to emerge. From the 4th century, after the recognition of Christianity under Emperor Constantine, fixed worship orders emerged. Music took up an increasingly large place in it. Different regions developed their own singing traditions, such as Ambrosian singing in Milan or Mozarabic singing in Spain. These regional traditions differed in melody, rhythm, and style, but all had in common that they were sung in unison and unaccompanied. In the 6th century, under Pope Gregory the Great, there was a standardization. He is credited with collecting and ordering the chants that were later called Gregorian chant. Whether Gregory himself was actually the creator of this tradition is historically disputed, but his name remained associated with it. Gregorian chant became the official form of liturgical chant of the Roman Church and profoundly shaped the Middle Ages. Characteristic of Gregorian chant is its monophony. All singers intonate the same melody, without harmonic accompaniment. This creates a pure, clear sound effect that puts the text in the center. Singing is syllabic or melasmic. In the syllabic form, each text syllable is assigned a tone. In the melasmic form, several notes can be heard on one syllable. These melasmic passages create an almost meditative effect that puts the listener in a spiritual atmosphere. The tonal system of Gregorian chant also differs from our current major-minor tonality. It is based on the so-called church modes, which emerged from the ancient modes. Each of these keys has its own character and emotional impact. In this way, Gregorian chant tied in with the Greek tradition, but combined it with the Christian liturgy. Gregorian chant was not only music, but also a liturgical tool. He structured the daily routine of the monasteries, accompanied the Mass and the Liturgy of the Hours, and gave a solemn framework to the religious acts. In the monasteries, which were centers of education and culture in the Middle Ages, the chant was cultivated, taught, and further developed. Monks and nuns sang daily at fixed times, making music a defining element of monastic life. The effect of Gregorian chant was profound. He shaped the spiritual experience of the faithful, shaped European musical culture, and laid the foundation for the development of polyphony. For the monophonic songs later developed into organum and polyphony, which determined the musical face of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Without Gregorian chant, the entire history of Western music would have been different. In addition, the chorale had a strong pedagogical and social function. At a time when many people were illiterate, he conveyed the message of faith in an impressive way. Music helped to memorize lyrics, and sharing in singing fostered a sense of belonging to the community of the church. Even though Gregorian chant underwent changes over the centuries, it remained a central element of the Catholic liturgy. To this day, it is cultivated in monasteries and repeatedly experiences phases of rediscovery, even outside the church context. Its simplicity and spiritual depth exert a timeless fascination. Thus, the emergence of Gregorian chant marks a decisive turning point in the history of music. Here music was finally put at the service of religion. It was given a fixed form and a written tradition. The simplicity of early Christian chants gave rise to a musical culture that lasted for centuries and laid the foundation for everything else. The chorale was not only an expression of faith, but also the beginning of an independent European musical culture.
Chapter 6. Music in the Middle Ages, from monastic culture to Menolyric. The Middle Ages were an epoch of profound changes in the history of music. While in the first centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, the monasteries were the preservers and developers of musical culture, from the High Middle Ages onwards, music increasingly opened up to secular areas. In addition to sacred singing, a rich tradition of secular poetry and music developed, which found its expression in minstrelsy, the traveling minstrels, and courtly festivals. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, Gregorian chant remained the central musical form. In the monasteries of Europe, it was an integral part of the daily liturgy of the hours. Monks and nuns sang the psalms and liturgical texts in the characteristic church keys that had been adopted from antiquity. With the development of neumes, an early form of musical notation, it became possible to record melodies more precisely. At first, the neumes only served as memory aids, but from the 11th century onwards, they developed into line notation, which made it possible to determine pitches precisely. This laid the foundation for today's musical notation. Parallel to the development of notation, polyphony emerged. At first, the monks sang simple parallel voices to the chorale, the so-called organum. From these simple parallels, a more complex polyphony developed in the 12th and 13th centuries, which was cultivated above all in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Composers such as Léonin and Perrotin created elaborate polyphonic works that enriched the liturgical repertoire. This marked the beginning of the emancipation of music as an independent art form that went beyond mere worship. But the Middle Ages were not only characterized by the sacred music of monasteries and cathedrals. From the 12th century onwards, a secular musical culture flourished, which was closely linked to the rise of chivalry and courtly culture. In France, the troubadours in the south and the trouvères in the north developed a rich tradition of courtly poetry. They sang about love, often in an idealized form, and thus shaped the image of Menelai, which was also taken up in Germany by minstrels such as Walther von der Wohleweide, Heinrich von Morungen, or Neidhart von Rehenthal. These songs combined poetic lyrics with melodic simplicity. They were usually monophonic, often accompanied by stringed instruments such as harps, lutes, or fiddles. The minnesong was not only used for entertainment, but was also an expression of a certain worldview. Courtly love, which was understood as a cultivated form of worship of an unattainable lady. Music thus became a medium of social values and norms.
In addition to courtly music, there was also the tradition of the traveling minstrels. They moved from town to town, from castle to castle, entertaining people with music, dance, acrobatics, and stories. Unlike the courtly poets, the minstrels often stood on the fringes of society and were considered shady and unreliable. Nevertheless, they played an important role in the dissemination of musical forms and ensured that music remained alive even outside the ecclesiastical and courtly circles. Instrumental music also gained an importance in the Middle Ages. In addition to the already mentioned harps and fiddles, wind instruments such as shawms, flutes, and horns, as well as percussion instruments such as drums and bells were used. Especially on festive occasions, weddings, tournaments, processions, music was indispensable. She structured the process, gave the event glamour, and provided entertainment. Another central element was the music theory of the Middle Ages. Scholars such as Boethius had passed on ancient music theory into the Middle Ages, and on this basis, theorists developed new systems. Guido of Arezzo, an 11th century monk, invented a system of line notation and psalmization which lives on to this day in the form of do, re, mi. In doing so, he laid the foundation for musical learning and the passing on of complex melodies. The music of the Middle Ages was thus characterized by a remarkable diversity. On the one hand, there was the strict liturgy of the church with its monophonic and later polyphonic music. On the other hand, the free, often folksy music of the minstrels and the cultivated poetry of the courts. Both spheres influenced each other. Elements of secular music found their way into church music, and spiritual themes appeared in secular songs. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, the Ars Nova developed in Italy and France, a new musical direction that introduced more complex rhythms and notations. Composers such as Guillaume de Machaut created elaborate secular and sacred works that paved the way for the transition to Renaissance music. The Middle Ages thus marked a decisive phase in music history. It was here that the foundations were laid that would shape Europe into the modern age. Musical notation, polyphony, the linking of music and poetry, the role of music in social and cultural life. The monastic simplicity of Gregorian chant gave rise to a rich, diverse musical culture that formed the foundation for centuries to come.
Chapter 7. The Development of Musical Notation and Its Importance. One of the most significant advances in the history of music was the invention and further development of musical notation. It made it possible not only to pass on melodies orally, but also to preserve them permanently and to pass them on over generations. Without musical notation, the rich tradition of European music would hardly be conceivable, because it allowed not only the exact transmission of sounds, but also the emergence of increasingly complex musical structures. In the first centuries of Christianity, music was handed down almost exclusively orally. Monks and clergy learned the liturgical chants by heart and passed them on to the next generation by singing aloud in post. This method worked as long as the melodies were relatively simple, but it led to variations and regional variations. The desire for standardization, especially in the liturgy, necessitated a more precise system of recording. The first beginnings can be found in the so-called neumes, which appeared from the 9th century onwards. Neumes were small signs that were placed over the text and gave a rough idea of the melody progression, whether the voice should rise or fall, whether a note was sung longer or shorter. They were not exact tone indications, but rather served as a memory aid for already known melodies. Nevertheless, they represented a decisive step, as they were the first attempt to capture music graphically. In the 11th century, the monk Guido of Arezzo brought a groundbreaking innovation: the introduction of line notation. He placed the neumes on horizontal lines that represented fixed pitches. Initially, there were 4 lines drawn in different colors to emphasize certain tones. This idea developed into the staff, which still forms the foundation of our musical notation today. With Guido's system, it was possible for the first time to accurately transmit melodies regardless of memory.
Guido also invented solmization, a pedagogical system that used the syllables ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la to name the tones of a hexachord scale. This system made it much easier to learn melodies and formed the basis for our do, re, mi today. In this way, Guido not only made music theory more precise, but also more practical. In the High Middle Ages, musical notation continued to develop. The neumes gradually became square notes on 4 lines, which can still be seen in choral books today. With the growing importance of polyphony, notation also had to become more precise. Menzoro notation emerged, which recorded not only pitches, but also exact note values. This made it possible to write down complicated rhythmic structures and polyphonic movements. Composers such as Lianin and Perrotin in Paris took advantage of these opportunities to create elaborate polyphonic works. The development of musical notation was more than just a technical aid. It changed musical thinking. Through the written fixation, music became independent of the moment. It could be disseminated over distances and passed on between generations. Sheet music enabled the emergence of a composed tradition in which works endured for centuries. This made music more plannable, more analyzable, and more complex. The dissemination of music was also revolutionized by musical notation. Monasteries and cathedrals created extensive hymn books that made it possible to sing uniformly throughout Europe. Later, with the invention of printing in the 15th century, sheet music could be copied in large editions. Music was no longer only cultivated in monasteries and at princely courts, but increasingly also ended up in the hands of citizens and laymen. Musical notation made a decisive contribution to music being able to establish itself as an autonomous art form. While oral music often remained flexible and changed, written works could be regarded as unchangeable. This led to a new understanding of work and composer. Music was no longer seen only as momentary art, but as an enduring cultural asset that could be preserved, studied, and interpreted. At the same time, musical notation opened up possibilities for music theory. Intervals, rhythms, and harmonies could now be systematically investigated. The development of tonal systems, the emergence of complex polyphony, and the development of entire styles would hardly have been conceivable without precise notation. The importance of musical notation is also reflected in the fact that it represents a unique selling point in European music history. Many cultures knew rich musical traditions but passed them on orally. Only in Europe has music been written down so consistently that an extensive historical collection has been preserved. That is why today we can perform works from the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, or the Baroque, while the music of many other cultures is only known in fragments. Thus, the development of musical notation was one of the decisive cultural achievements of the Middle Ages. It not only made it possible to preserve and pass on music, but also fundamentally shaped musical thinking. Music became plannable, analyzable, and complex. Without musical notation, the entire history of European music as we know it would not have been possible. Chapter 8: Music in the Renaissance, Polyphony and Humanism. The Renaissance marked the beginning of a new era in Europe that profoundly changed not only art, science, and philosophy, but also music. The term Renaissance means rebirth and refers to the return to antiquity. The focus was on humanism, the idea that people and their creative abilities should be the focus. This new mindset was also reflected in the music. It became freer, more expressive, and more artistic. A central characteristic of Renaissance music was polyphony, i.e. polyphony. As early as the late Middle Ages, the technique of making several voices sound at the same time had developed. In the Renaissance, however, it reached a level of perfection that had never been achieved before. Composers such as Josquin des Prez, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, or Orlando di Lasso created works of the greatest tonal balance in which the voices were artfully intertwined. Polyphony was no longer a mere experiment, but the dominant form of musical expression. The sound of Renaissance music is characterized by imitation. One voice introduces a motif that is taken up by the other voices one after the other. This creates a dense network of sounds that gives the impression of harmony and order. At the same time, the comprehensibility of the text was in the foreground, especially in church music. Palestrina is considered a master of this balance. His masses and motets are characterized by a clear intelligibility of the text, which is retained even with the greatest polyphony. It is not for nothing that he became the model of church music of the Counter-Reformation. The Renaissance was also a heyday of sacred music. The Catholic Church remained a central client, but the Reformation also led to significant innovations. Martin Luther recognized the importance of music for the dissemination of his ideas. He promoted congregational singing and introduced the chorale song in German. This development had lasting consequences. Music became more accessible and a tool of religious education. Protestant church music formed the basis for later developments, for example with Johann Sebastian Bach. In addition to church music, secular music also flourished. Madrigals, chansons, and villanelles enjoyed great popularity. These vocal works, often polyphonic and artistically designed, served as entertainment and reflected the themes of humanism: love, nature, life, and its joys. The madrigal in particular, which originated in Italy, combined poetry and music in an artistic way. Poetic text was reinforced by musical means of expression, such as text painting. When there was talk of rising, the melody also rose. With words like sighing or crying, the notes fell melancholy. It is not for nothing that he became the model of church music of the Counter-Reformation. The Renaissance was also a heyday of sacred music. The Catholic Church remained a central client, but the Reformation also led to significant innovations. Martin Luther recognized the importance of music for the dissemination of his ideas. He promoted congregational singing and introduced the chorale song in German. This development had lasting consequences. Music became more accessible and a tool of religious education. Protestant church music formed the basis for later developments, for example with Johann Sebastian Bach. In addition to church music, secular music also flourished. Madrigals, chansons, and villanelles enjoyed great popularity. These vocal works, often polyphonic and artistically designed, served as entertainment and reflected the themes of humanism: love, nature, life, and its joys. The madrigal in particular, which originated in Italy, combined poetry and music in an artistic way. Poetic texts were reinforced by musical means of expression, such as text painting. When there was talk of rising, the melody also rose. With words like sighing or crying, the notes fell melancholy. The Renaissance was also a time of instrument making and instrumental music. Many of the instruments we know today were created or were decisively developed. The lute became the most popular plucked instrument, the violas and later the violin family developed, and keyboard instruments such as the clavichord and harpsichord appeared. Wind instruments such as the recorder, the sham, or the trombone also gained in importance. With these new instruments, a rich tradition of instrumental music also emerged. Although vocal music remained the focus, composers began to write their own pieces for instruments. Dances such as Pavan, Gagliarda, or Allemande became popular and reflected the social life at the courts. Music was not only sacred art, but also part of pleasure and representation. An important factor was the invention of printing with movable type by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century, which was soon transferred to music. Printed music could now be distributed in larger editions. This made music accessible to a wider class, and composers were able to make their works known far beyond their home region. The spread of sheet music led to an internationalization of music. Styles and ideas circulated between Italy, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Renaissance music was not only art, but also an expression of a new worldview. While in the Middle Ages the focus was on the transcendent, the otherworldly, the Renaissance turned more to this world. Music reflected the richness of human feelings. It became the medium of joy, melancholy, love, and passion. At the same time, she remained deeply connected to religion and spirituality, but in a new balance between divine order and human expression. In architecture and painting, the Renaissance sought harmony, proportion, and beauty. The same principles also determined music. Polyphony was not chaos, but a carefully ordered interplay that embodied the spirit of the time. The Renaissance thus marked a heyday of music in which technical perfection, artistic expression, and a new humanity came together. It prepared the ground for the great developments of the Baroque era, in which music was to become even more dramatic, virtuoso, and emotional. But already in the Renaissance it became clear that music is more than liturgical singing. It is a mirror of human expression and creativity.
Chapter 9. Instrument Making and Its Role in the Renaissance. The Renaissance was not only an era of intellectual and artistic flourishing, but also a time of significant technical innovations. While poets, painters, and composers were looking for new forms of expression, the construction of musical instruments also changed fundamentally. The variety and quality of the instruments increased considerably, which gave the music new timbres and allowed it to develop in previously unimagined directions. Instrument making thus played a central role in the design of Renaissance music and paved the way for the development of orchestral culture in the following centuries. A revolution took place in the string instrument family. The lute in particular experienced a heyday. It was the most popular instrument of the Renaissance, both in courtly circles and among the bourgeoisie. With its round body, numerous strings, and soft sound, it was ideal for intimate music, whether as an accompaniment to songs or as a solo instrument. Lutenists created elaborate fantasies, dances, and variations that are still among the highlights of Renaissance music today. At the same time, the viola family developed. These string instruments had flat shoulders and were held between the knees. They differed from today's violins in their softer, nasal sound. Viola ensembles played an important role in chamber music of the Renaissance. Gradually, the violin family, which was developed in northern Italy, also appeared. With its brighter, stronger sound, it prevailed over time and became the heart of orchestral music in the Baroque. The keyboard instruments also made great progress. The clavichord and harpsichord were further developed and found their place in the homes of wealthy citizens and nobles. The clavichord was quiet and intended for domestic use, while the harpsichord, with its bright percussive sound, sounded in larger rooms. Composers began to write their own works for these instruments, which not only served as accompaniment but also emphasized the virtuosity of the player. Wind instruments also experienced a remarkable development. The recorder became an important instrument in chamber music and was available in various sizes, from soprano to bass. It was particularly suitable for ensemble playing, as its clear, gentle sound harmonized well with other instruments. The sham, a double-reed instrument and forerunner of the oboe, was louder and more suitable for outdoor use. In addition, there were horns, trombones, and cornets, which sounded both in church music and on festive occasions. A particularly characteristic instrument of the Renaissance was the cornet, a wooden wind instrument with finger holes that was blown like a trumpet. Its sound was between trumpet and oboe and could come surprisingly close to the human voice. The cornetto was often used in combination with the trombone, especially in church music, where it doubled and amplified singing. The percussion instruments also played an important role, especially in dance music. Drums, tambourines, and bells accompanied the dances at courtly festivals. They set the rhythm and provided the rousing energy that was necessary for the popular ballroom dances such as pavane, galliard, or allemande.
Progress in instrument making was closely linked to the growing demand for ensemble music. While in the Middle Ages, instruments were often used as soloists or to double singing, the idea of the instrumental ensemble developed in the Renaissance. Consorts of similar instruments, such as a flute or viola consort, played pieces that were composed especially for these ensembles. This created a new variety of sounds, which allowed the composers to implement musical ideas in a more differentiated way. Another important factor was the increasing standardization of instruments. While many instruments in the Middle Ages varied greatly from region to region, the workshops of the Renaissance led to a standardization in construction and tuning. This facilitated the interplay and laid the foundation for the development of the orchestra in the Baroque period. Instrument making was also an expression of craftsmanship and social status. Famous workshops in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands produced instruments of the highest quality, appreciated not only for their sound but also for their artistic decorations. Instruments became prestige objects that underlined the wealth and education of their owner. The role of instrument making in the Renaissance cannot be underestimated. Without the further development of lutes, violas, flutes, and keyboard instruments, the music of this epoch would not have been able to achieve its richness of timbres. Technical progress created the basis for a new genre, independent instrumental music, which was to flourish in the Baroque. This shows that the Renaissance was not only a time of great composers, but also an era of ingenious craftsmen. Their instruments enabled the musicians to make the ideals of humanism, harmony, beauty, expression audible. They combined art, technology, and culture in a way that permanently changed the history of music.
Chapter 10. The Birth of Opera in Italy. Opera, one of the most important musical genres of European culture, has its origins in Italy at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. It combines music, theater, poetry, and stage art into a total work of art that is unique in its effect. Its birth was not an accidental event, but the result of a long development in the Renaissance and early Baroque, in which humanism, musical experimentation, and the need for new forms of expression were combined. The roots of the opera lie in the humanist circles of the Florentine Camerata. This group of scholars, poets, and musicians who met in Florence in the late 16th century had the goal of reviving the art forms of antiquity. They were particularly fascinated by ancient drama, which they imagined as a combination of spoken text, music, and dance. Since the exact performance practice of Greek tragedies was unknown, they experimented with new forms to musically revive the spirit of antiquity. A key concept was the monodic principle. While the music of the Renaissance was strongly polyphonic, the humanists were looking for a clearer, more understandable form of the text. In the monody, a single singer was accompanied by a basso continuum. The focus was on the expressiveness of the text and the voice, not on artful polyphony. This gave rise to a new kind of musical expression that paved the way to opera. Among the first attempts were works such as Jacopo Peri's Daphne, 1597, and Eurydice, 1600, which are considered the earliest operas in music history. They told mythological material with through-composed singing, which alternated between recitative narrative and lyrical arias. The aim was to transport the emotions of the characters directly through music and to move the audience in a new, intense way. However, the decisive breakthrough came with Claudio Monteverdi. His work, L'Orfeo, 1607, is considered the first great opera and a prime example of the fusion of music and drama. Combining the monodic experiments of the Camerata with the expressiveness of Renaissance polyphony, Monteverdi created a work of overwhelming emotional intensity. L'Orfeo was premiered at the court of Mantua and told the mythological story of Orpheus, whose singing was able to move even the underworld. Monteverdi's opera was more than just a courtly experiment. It laid the foundation for a new art form. He introduced musical forms that are still formative for opera today: the recitative, in which the action is told, and the aria, in which feelings are deepened and musically shaped.
In addition, there were instrumental interludes, choruses, and dances, which made the work varied and dramatic. The opera quickly spread beyond Italy. In Venice, the first public opera house, the Teatro San Cassiano, was built in 1637. This meant that the opera was no longer performed at princely courts, but was also open to a paying audience. Venice developed into the center of a flourishing opera culture in which composers such as Francesco Cavalli and Antonio Cesti worked. The opera became a commercial success that fascinated artists, musicians, and audiences alike. The success of the opera was also related to the zeitgeist of the Baroque. This era was looking for expressiveness, drama, and sensual effect. Architecture, painting, and literature aimed to create emotions. Opera was the musical equivalent of it. She combined magnificent stage sets, virtual songs, and deeply moving stories to create an experience that appealed to all the senses. An essential part was the development of the art of castrato. In order to preserve the high voices, which were considered particularly expressive in the Italian ideal, young singers were castrated before they broke their voices. The castrati became the stars of Baroque opera, revered like today's pop idols. Their virtuoso arias, full of colorata and technical brilliance, were highlights of the performances and fascinated audiences throughout Europe. The birth of opera had not only musical but also cultural significance. It combined different arts into an overall experience that set new standards. Poets, composers, painters, architects, and stage builders worked together to bring a story to life in music, words, and images. This collaboration made opera a symbol of Baroque culture, in which art was not thought of in isolation, but as a unit. Already in the first decades, opera spread beyond Italy to France, Germany, and England, where it each produced its own traditions. But the origin remained Italy, where it arose from the spirit of humanism and the desire for a rebirth of antiquity. The birth of opera thus marks a turning point in the history of music. For the first time, a genre systematically combined music, theater, and poetry into a cohesive whole. It opened up completely new possibilities of musical expression and shaped European culture for centuries. From Monteverdi to Mozart to Wagner, Verdi, and Puccini, all later masters built on this foundation, which was laid in Florence and Mantua around 1600. Chapter 11. Music in the Baroque, Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi. The Baroque, which lasted from about 1600 to 1750, was an era of splendor, drama, and emotion. Music became a central means of expression of this time, in which the arts aspired to move, overwhelm, and take the audience into another world. Architecture, painting, and literature were looking for splendor and expressiveness. Music did the same, and developed into an art full of contrasts, virtuosity, and emotional depth. A defining feature of Baroque music was the practice of basso continuo. Almost every work of this period was carried by a bass part, which was played by instruments such as cello, bassoon, or viola da gamba, and harmoniously filled by a keyboard instrument, such as harpsichord or organ. The basso continuo formed the foundation on which the melodies and ornaments rested. This practice gave composers the opportunity to develop great freedom in the shaping of the upper voices, while at the same time ensuring a stable structure. The music of the Baroque was characterized by the theory of affects, the idea that music should specifically evoke certain feelings, affects. A piece could express love, sorrow, joy, or anger musically, and the composers used melody, harmony, and rhythm to portray these emotions as impressively as possible. Music thus became a language of feelings that could also be understood without words. During this epoch, numerous new musical forms developed. The opera, which had been written in Italy, experienced a heyday. Composers such as Claudio Monteverdi, Francesco Cavalli, and later George Friedrich Handel created works that thrilled audiences with magnificent stage sets and virtuoso arias. In addition, the oratorio was created, a sacred form that drew on operatic elements but was performed in concert. Handel's Messiah is still one of the best-known examples today. Instrumental music also gained a new significance in the Baroque. The sonata, the concerto, and the suite developed into genres in their own right. Especially the concerto grosso, in which a small group of solo instruments interacted with the orchestra, was typical of the time. This form later developed into the solo concerto, which offered a stage for virtuosos. Three composers stand out in particular during this period: Johann Sebastian Bach, Georg Friedrich Handel, and Antonio Vivaldi. Bach, born in Germany, is considered the epitome of the Baroque composer. His music combines the highest contrapuntal artistry with emotional depth. Works such as the Well-Tempered Clavier, the Brandenburg Concertos, or the St. Matthew Passion show his ability to combine the most complex structures with poignant expressiveness. Bach was not only a master of organ and piano music, but also a deeply religious person whose sacred works are still among the highlights of church music today. Handel, also from Germany, made a career in Italy and later in England. He was a master of opera, but also knew how to inspire English audiences with oratorios. Works such as Julius Caesar, Rinaldo, or the famous Messiah show his ability to combine great dramatic scenes with catchy melodies. Handel knew how to create musical emotions directly and effectively, which is why his works enjoy great popularity to this day. Vivaldi, the Red Priest from Venice, shaped the genre of the concerto above all. His Four Seasons are among the most famous works of classical music ever. Vivaldi was a master at translating images of nature into music. The chirping of birds, the rustling of the wind, the thunder of a thunderstorm, all of this can be found in his concerts. In addition, he composed hundreds of concertos, operas, and sacred works that show his virtuosity and melodic inventiveness. The Baroque was also an epoch of great instrument development. The violin, which originated in Italy in the 16th century, finally prevailed and became the leading melodic instrument. The harpsichord was the central keyboard instrument, and the organ experienced a heyday, especially in the churches. Wind instruments such as oboe, bassoon, and trumpet were refined and found their permanent place in the orchestra. Court orchestras and municipal ensembles grew into larger ensembles, which strings, winds, and continuo played together. This created the basis for the classical orchestra of the following era. The Baroque was not only a time of musical splendor, but also of contrasts. On the one hand, the music was in the service of the church and the court. On the other hand, it developed an expressiveness that emphasized the individual feelings of the human being. She combined strict order with passionate expression, mathematical structure with emotional impact. The Baroque era ends around 1750, the year of Johann Sebastian Bach's death. But his achievements, the practice of the basso continuo, the theory of affects, the development of the major forms, continue to shape the music today. Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi are representative of a time when music became a universal language of emotions that touched people in all walks of life.
Chapter 12. Viennese Classicism, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. With the Viennese Classicism, European music reached an era in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that is still considered the high point of the classical music tradition today. The term classical refers to an orientation towards moderation, clarity, and balance, similar to ancient art. During this time, musical forms and works were created that are considered the epitome of Western music and are performed worldwide. The names Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven are inextricably linked with this era. The social framework played a major role in the development of Viennese classicism. Vienna was the cultural center of Europe, shaped by the courtly culture of the Habsburgs and at the same time by an up-and-coming bourgeoisie that increasingly sought access to music and concerts. Music was no longer intended exclusively for the nobility, but found its way into concert halls and bourgeois salons. This also changed the role of the composer.
He was no longer just a court employee, but could also reach an audience through public performances and the sale of sheet music. A central characteristic of Viennese classicism was the development of clear formal principles. The sonata form, in particular, became the basis of many compositions. It consists of exposition, development, and recapitulation, and allows thematic material to be developed and resumed in an exciting way. This form was used in symphonies, concertos, and chamber music pieces, and gave the music a structure that was both logical and expressive. Joseph Haydn, often referred to as the father of the symphony and father of the string quartet, laid the foundations. He worked for a long time in the service of Prince Esterházy, where he was able to experiment and develop new things under stable conditions. His more than 100 symphonies show an enormous variety of expression, humor, and innovation. Haydn knew how to play with musical surprises. Sudden pauses, dynamic contrasts, or unexpected turns kept the audience in suspense. With his string quartets, he also shaped a genre that became the heart of chamber music. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart took Haydn's achievements to the highest perfection. Celebrated as a child prodigy, he developed into a composer of universal mastery. Mozart's music is characterized by lightness, elegance, and melodic beauty, but at the same time by deep expression. His operas such as Don Giovanni, The Magic Flute, or La Nozze di Figaro combine dramatic action with psychological depth and everlasting music. His symphonies and piano concerts show a perfect balance between virtuosity and formal clarity. Mozart embodied the spirit of Viennese classicism like no other, art that entertains, touches, and intellectually convinces in equal measure. Finally, Ludwig van Beethoven broke the boundaries of the classical period and pointed to the Romantic period. He adopted the forms of Haydn and Mozart, but filled them with a hitherto unknown emotional power. His 9 symphonies are monuments to music history. Especially the third, Eroica, the fifth with its famous ta-ta-ta-ta motif, and the ninth with the Ode to Joy chorus stand for the transition from classical balance to romantic depth of expression. Beethoven made the symphony a medium of existential statements about freedom, fate, and humanity. The Viennese classical period was also an epoch of chamber music. The string quartet, consisting of 2 violins, viola, and cello, developed into the most demanding genre of domestic and concert music. The works of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven show the whole art of musical dialogue. 4 voices that communicate with each other on an equal footing, complement and contradict each other. Equally important was the development of the piano concerto. The piano, which replaced the harpsichord in the 18th century, allowed for a greater dynamic range and expressiveness. Mozart composed numerous piano concerts in which he himself shone as a virtuoso. Beethoven led the genre to monumental grandeur by bringing the orchestra and the solo instrument into a dramatic interplay. Another characteristic of Viennese classicism was the close connection between form and expression. The music never seemed random or chaotic, but was always clearly structured. At the same time, she transported emotions from cheerful serenity to tragic depth. This balance made them timeless and universally understandable. Viennese classicism was not only a musical but also a cultural heyday. It reflected the ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, moderation, order, and combined them with the emerging longing for freedom and individuality, which was to be even more prominent in Romanticism. In the works of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, European music reached a high point that has remained the benchmark to this day. Thus, Viennese classicism marks an era in which music became a universal language that appealed to all strata of society. She created works that are timeless in their beauty and expressiveness and shaped the understanding of music as an art form that touches the mind and heart in equal measure. With Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, Western music reached a peak that is still considered unsurpassed today.
Chapter 13.
Music as an expression of Romanticism. Schubert, Schumann, Chopin. Romanticism, which developed out of Viennese Classicism in the early 19th century, fundamentally changed the role of music. Whereas in classical music, measure, order, and balance dominated, now individual feeling, longing, and subjective expression came to the fore. Music became the direct expression of the soul, a mirror of inner worlds and unspeakable emotions. Poets such as Novalis or E.T.A. Hoffmann shaped Romantic thought, and composers took up these currents by understanding music as the language of the infinite. A key idea of Romanticism was subjectivity. Composers no longer just wanted to portray general feelings in a balanced way, but to express personal feelings. This led to a greater variety of musical forms and styles, ranging from the intimate piano piece to the monumental symphony. Franz Schubert is considered one of the first great romantics. He combined the classical form with a new intimacy and songfulness. His more than 600 songs in particular show the romantic connection between music and poetry. In works such as Winterreise or Schönenmüllerin, word and sound merge into a unity that leads the listener deep into the spiritual world of the lyrical ego. Schubert's songs are small dramas in which nature, longing, love, and death are thematized. But also in his symphonies, such as the Unfinished or the Great C Major, a new romantic sound world full of melody and lyrical beauty unfolds. Robert Schumann was not only a composer but also a music critic and writer. His works are characterized by poetic ideas and literary references. In particular, his piano cycles, such as the Children's Scenes, the Carnaval, or the Kreisleriana, show the romantic urge to musically portray inner moods and characters. Schumann was a master at creating musical miniatures that seem like snapshots of the soul. At the same time, he shaped the romantic variety of expression with his symphonies, chamber music works, and songs. Another giant of Romanticism was Frédéric Chopin, the Polish piano virtuoso. He wrote almost exclusively for the piano and created works of incomparable emotionality and elegance. His nocturnes, mazurkas, polonaises, and etudes are an expression of deep longing, lyrical melancholy, and virtuoso brilliance. Chopin combined the folk music of his Polish homeland with the sophistication of the Paris salon, where he worked as a celebrated pianist. His music is the epitome of romantic intimacy and at the same time of high technical sophistication. However, Romanticism not only produced new composers, but also a changed role of the artist's personality. While composers of the classical period often appeared as servants of the court or the church, the Romantics saw themselves as free, brilliant individuals whose work was an expression of their innermost feelings. The image of the lonely, suffering artist who reveals his soul in his music shaped the Romantic self-image. An important characteristic of Romantic music was program music, which represented concrete content, moods, or stories. Symphonic poems, such as those later composed by Franz Liszt or Richard Strauss, had their roots in the early Romantic period. But Schubert's and Schumann's works also contain programmatic elements that combine music with poetry, images of nature, or literary figures. Romanticism also brought an expansion of harmony and form. Composers dared to use bolder modulations, unexpected chord combinations, and new timbres. This strengthened the richness of expression and led the music to the limits of tonality, which were finally to be exceeded in the late 19th century. The role of the piano also became decisive in the Romantic period. It was the preferred instrument of the era, suitable for both intimate domestic music and virtuoso concert halls. Composers such as Schubert, Schumann, and Chopin created a repertoire that is still considered the pinnacle of piano literature today. The piano became an instrument of personal confessions and quiet dreams, a mirror of romantic inwardness. Romanticism was at the same time an era of song recitals and salon music. Music was not only present in the large concert halls, but also in private settings, where songs and piano pieces were performed. This closeness between artist and audience reinforced the feeling that music is an intimate language of the soul. Romanticism thus marked a decisive turning point in music history. She freed music from strict formal boundaries and made it the direct expression of individual feelings. Schubert, Schumann, and Chopin stand for an era in which music became a language of the inner that expressed feelings, longing, and dreams in an incomparable way. Her works are still the epitome of romantic music today and touch people worldwide with their timeless emotionality. Chapter 14. Late Romanticism and Musical Megalomania. Wagner, Liszt, Mahler. The late Romanticism of the 19th century was an era of extremes. While early Romanticism was still characterized by intimacy, lyrical intimacy, and personal expressiveness, late Romanticism strove for grandeur, monumentality, and overwhelm. Music became a worldview, a philosophy, almost a religion. Composers such as Richard Wagner, Franz Liszt, and Gustav Mahler searched for new dimensions in which music could not only express feelings, but also represent entire worldviews. Richard Wagner was probably the most influential figure of the late Romantic period. For him, music was not simply an art form, but a means to realize his vision of the Gesamtkunstwerk. In his operas, which he called music dramas, he combined poetry, music, stage design, and drama into a single unit. His Ring des Nibelungen, a cycle of 4 full-length operas, is a monument to music history. With a huge orchestra, leitmotif technique, and endlessly flowing melodies, Wagner created a world that combined mythical material, philosophical ideas, and musical innovation. Franz Liszt was probably the most influential figure of the late Romantic period. For him, music was not simply an art form, but a means to realize his vision of the Gesamtkunstwerk. In his operas, which he called music dramas, he combined poetry, music, stage design, and drama into a single unit. His Ring des Nibelungen, a cycle of 4 full-length operas, is a monument to music history. With a huge orchestra, leitmotif technique, and endlessly flowing melodies, Wagner created a world that combined mythical material, philosophical ideas, and musical innovation. A central element of his music was the leitmotif, short musical themes that were associated with certain characters, feelings, or ideas. These motifs appeared again and again, were varied, and further developed. This created a musical structure that supported the drama and helped the audience to emotionally understand the plot. Wagner thus fundamentally changed the understanding of opera. It was no longer a sequence of arias and recitatives, but a continuous stream of music and action. Franz Liszt was also a revolutionary. As one of the greatest piano virtuosos of his time, he was already a legend during his lifetime. His concerts triggered storms of enthusiasm, which were later called Listomania. But Liszt was more than a pianist. He was also a visionary composer. With the symphonic poem, he created a new genre that translated extra musical content such as literature, poetry, or nature into music. Works such as Les Préludes or Mazeppa are sonorous stories that unfold drama, passion, and ideas in sounds. Liszt was also a seeker who reinvented himself again and again. His late works already point to modernism, harmoniously bold, often of a brittle beauty that went beyond the traditional framework. His music shows the urge of the late Romantic period to push the boundaries of expression further and further. Finally, Gustav Mahler brought the late Romantic period to its last great development. His symphonies are world designs in tones. Mahler himself once said, "A symphony must be like the world. It must encompass everything." In his monumental works, images of nature, folk songs, religious themes, and personal confessions merge into powerful sound paintings. His Second Symphony, the Resurrection Symphony, ends with an overwhelming choral finale that tells of death, redemption, and eternal life. The Eighth Symphony, often called the Symphony of 1,000, bursts all dimensions with its gigantic orchestral and choral effort. Mahler was also a master of nuances. In addition to the monumental outbursts, there are tender, intimate moments in his music, often inspired by folk songs or nursery rhymes. This mixture of cosmic aspirations and personal intimacy is what makes his work so fascinating to this day. However, late Romanticism was not only an era of musical innovation, but also a time of exuberance. Orchestras became bigger and bigger, works longer and longer, harmonies more and more bold. Wagner staffed orchestras with over 100 musicians. Mahler demanded huge sound apparatuses for his symphonies. The urge for size was also reflected in the architecture. Wagner's Festspielhaus in Bayreuth was built specifically for his music dramas, with revolutionary acoustics and a concealed orchestra pit. At the same time, this megalomania led to the limits of traditional tonality. The harmony became more and more complex, the dissonances more and more daring. Composers such as Wagner and Liszt thus paved the way for the dissolution of tonality in modernism. Wagner's Tristan chord in particular is considered a key moment. Its limbo between resolution and tension was an omen of the atonality systematized by Arnold Schoenberg and others in the 20th century. Late Romanticism was thus an epic of extremes. Between intimacy and monumentality, between tradition and new beginnings, between longing for transcendence and radical subjectivity. She produced works that are still among the most impressive achievements in music history. Wagner, Liszt, and Mahler embody this spirit. One as the creator of gigantic music dramas, the other as a virtuoso and reinventor of form, the third as a symphonist who captured the universe in music. But this era was also the end of an era. With Mahler, who died in 1911, and Richard Strauss, who rescued the late Romantic period into the 20th century, the Romantic ideal of all-encompassing was exhausted. The urge for ever greater expressiveness inevitably led to a break, to modernity, which had to look for new paths.
Chapter 15. The Dawn of Modernity. Debussy, Schoenberg, Stravinsky. The beginning of the 20th century marked a deep turning point in music history. While late Romanticism grew into monumental dimensions and tonality was pushed to its limits, the need for new forms of expression arose. Composers were looking for ways to free music from the shackles of tradition and do justice to the sound worlds of their time. The dawn of modernism produced an enormous diversity. Impressionism, Expressionism, atonality, neoclassicism, and many other currents existed side by side. Three composers exemplify this upheaval: Claude Debussy, Arnold Schoenberg, and Igor Stravinsky. Claude Debussy is considered the founder of musical impressionism. Inspired by the painting of the same name, he searched for new timbres and structures that were not based on strict form, but on moods and atmospheres. His famous orchestral piece, Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune, 1894, broke away from classical tonality and relied on floating harmonies, refined instrumentation, and melodic fragments that hinted rather than clearly formulated. Debussy's music often seems like a fleeting dream, full of nuances and subtle colors. His piano works, such as the Clair de Lune or the Preludes, show the same predilection for tonal nuances. Debussy experimented with whole tone scales, pentatonic scales, and unconventional chords, which opened up a new harmonic freedom. He did not want to write symphonies in the monumental style of Romanticism, but small, precise sound images that seem like musical watercolors. In doing so, he pointed the way to a music that no longer relied on linear development, but on moment and color. While Debussy stretched the tonality, Arnold Schoenberg went one step further. He dissolved it completely.
As the founder of atonality and later of the 12-tone technique, he radically broke with tradition. Schoenberg felt that the classical major-minor tonality was exhausted and was looking for a new order. In early atonal works such as Erwartung or the 5 orchestral pieces, he created sound worlds of intense expressiveness that no longer knew a tonal hierarchy. In order to give structure to this freedom, Schoenberg developed the 12-tone method in the 1920s. It was based on the idea that all 12 tones of the chromatic scale should be treated equally. A fixed tone series served as the basis from which melodies, harmonies, and structures were derived. With this technique, Schoenberg wanted to create a new, logical order that could succeed tonality. His students Alban Berg and Anton Webern continued these ideas and formed the so-called Second Viennese School with him. Schoenberg's music was initially highly controversial, with many finding it incomprehensible or even provocative. But it marked a decisive turning point. The step into atonality opened the door to radically modern music that freed itself from the centuries-old laws of harmony. Igor Stravinsky, one of the most influential composers of the 20th century, took a different path. His early ballet, The Firebird, 1910, was still strongly influenced by Russian folklore and late Romantic colors, but with Petrushka, 1911, and especially Le Sacre du Printemps, 1913, he revolutionized music. Le Sacre, with its pounding rhythms, rugged dissonances, and archaic sounds, caused a scandal at its premiere, but it was also the beginning of a new era. Stravinsky did not rely on harmonic innovation alone, but on rhythm as a central design tool. Polyrhythms, irregular beats, and sharp accents gave his music a tremendous energy. At the same time, in later phases of his work, he drew on neoclassical elements by reinterpreting forms and styles of the classical and Baroque periods. Works such as Pulcinella or the Symphony in C show this recollection, which, however, was always formulated in a modern way. Modernism was not characterized by a uniform style, but by a plurality of currents. Debussy sought the sound magic of the moment. Schoenberg, radical renewal through strict systems, Stravinsky, rhythmic energy and stylistic diversity. All three broke with tradition and opened new paths that influenced the entire 20th century. The dawn of modernity was also an expression of the social upheavals of the time. Industrialization, urbanization, technical innovations, and political crises were reflected in the music. Composers were looking for forms that did justice to these new realities. They broke away from the romantic idea of all-encompassing expression and instead relied on fragment, rupture, provocation, and experimentation. This marked the beginning of an era in which music no longer only sought beauty and harmony, but also expressed restlessness, dissonance, and contradiction. Modernism was a mirror of a world in upheaval, and at the same time, an artistic laboratory that expanded the boundaries of hearing and thinking. Chapter 16. Music Between the World Wars. Jazz, New Objectivity, Political Music. The period between the First and Second World Wars was marked by profound social and political upheavals that also had a lasting influence on music. After the catastrophes of the First World War, artists were looking for new forms of expression that did justice to the experiences of a torn world. During this phase, contrasting currents emerged. While jazz came to Europe from the USA and evoked enthusiasm as well as rejection, European composers relied on sobriety, clarity, and a turn to socio-political topics. The music of this time was diverse, contradictory, and full of tension, a mirror of the era. One of the biggest innovations was the rise of jazz. It originated in the African American communities of the USA, from a mixture of blues, ragtime, spirituals, and European influences. With its swing, syncopation, and improvisation, jazz brought a whole new energy to the music world. Musicians such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, or later Benny Goodman made jazz an art form that went far beyond entertainment. In Europe, jazz was initially perceived as an exotic fashion. Dance orchestras took up elements, and jazz clubs sprang up in cities such as Berlin or Paris, which became a meeting place for the avant-garde. Many young people perceived jazz as an expression of freedom, modernity, and internationality. At the same time, he met with rejection. Conservative circles saw in him a degenerate music that allegedly endangered traditional values. In Germany, this attitude was later to be ideologically abused by the National Socialists. At the same time, the new objectivity movement developed in Europe. After the excesses of late Romanticism and the experiments of early modernism, composers such as Paul Hindemith, Kurt Weill, and Ernst Krenek sought music that was clear, sober, and understandable. Instead of subjective emotional outbursts, the aim was to create objective, usable music that could also fulfill practical functions, be it in the theater, on the radio, or in school. Kurt Weill, in collaboration with Bertolt Brecht, combined socio-critical content with catchy music. Works such as the Threepenny Opera or The Rise and Fall of the City of Mahogany became symbols of a new music that was both art and political statement. Weill used elements of jazz, popular music, and classical tradition to reach a wide audience. His music was not elitist, but deliberately popular, a means of enlightenment and criticism. Paul Hindemith also embodied the new objectivity. He composed works that relied on clear forms and technical solidity. His concept of utility music emphasized that music should fulfill practical functions, whether for amateur ensembles, schools, or social occasions. Hindemith's music was often austere, but also full of energy and rhythmic conciseness. Another characteristic of this epoch was the politicization of music. In view of the social crises and the emerging totalitarian regimes, many artists could not remain uninvolved. In the Soviet Union, music was created that was supposed to be committed to the ideals of socialism. Composers like Dmitri Shostakovich stood between conformity and resistance. On the one hand, they composed works that met official requirements, and on the other hand, they hid criticism and personal statements in their music. Shostakovich's symphonies are still testimonies to this double message: heroic on the outside, desperate on the inside. In Germany and Italy, the National Socialists and Fascists used music for their propaganda. Degenerate music, including jazz, atonality, or works by Jewish composers, was banned. At the same time, traditional, popular, or heroic works were promoted. Many artists emigrated, including Weill, Schoenberg, and Hindemith, and left their mark on the music of the USA in exile. The music between the world wars was also influenced by the new media. Radio and records enabled a much wider distribution of music. Jazz records were listened to worldwide. Radio broadcasts brought symphonies and operas into living rooms. This led to a democratization of musical culture, but also to commercialization, which opened up new fields of tension. Despite all their differences, the musical currents of the interwar period had something in common. They were looking for new ways to express the reality of a torn world. Jazz reflected freedom and modernity. New objectivity, sober clarity, and social responsibility. Political music, the struggle between conformity and resistance. The period between the world wars was musically as diverse as it was contradictory, an expression of an era that oscillated between hope, crisis, and catastrophe. Chapter 17: Music in the Age of World War II and the Post-War Period. The Second World War and the years that followed posed enormous challenges for music. At a time when entire societies were destroyed and millions of people lost their lives, music was both a means of propaganda and an expression of comfort, resistance, and hope. After the war, a phase of new beginnings began, in which the music scene reoriented itself and questioned old traditions. The era was marked by ruptures, but also by the search for new paths. During the war, music played an ambivalent role. In the totalitarian states, it was used massively for propaganda purposes. In Germany, the Nazi regime promoted works that were considered popular and heroic, while jazz, a tonality, or the music of Jewish composers were banned as degenerate. Composers such as Richard Strauss came to terms with the regime in some cases, while others such as Paul Hindemith or Arnold Schoenberg went into exile. Numerous musicians of Jewish origin were persecuted, expelled, or murdered. Music was thus inextricably linked to the political and moral issues of the time. At the same time, however, music also served resistance and hope. In ghettos and concentration camps, prisoners composed and played music despite unimaginable conditions. Works by Victor Ullmann, Gideon Klein, and Hans Krasse, which were created in the Theresienstadt ghetto, are moving testimonies to human dignity and creativity under the most extreme circumstances. Traditional songs or improvised music also provided comfort and gave people a sense of identity and cohesion. In the Allied states, music played an important role in strengthening morale. Jazz and swing were symbols of freedom and joie de vivre. Orchestras toured to entertain the soldiers, and songs such as We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn gave hope for a better future. In the USA, too, music became an expression of national cohesion. Composers such as Aaron Copland created works that radiated optimism and closeness to the people. After 1945, music was faced with the task of a new beginning. There was destruction in Europe, and many musicians and institutions had to be rebuilt from scratch. At the same time, the question arose as to how one could continue artistically after the crimes of the war. Many artists wanted a radical break with the past and were looking for new, experimental ways. One of the centers of this search was serial music, which was developed by composers such as Olivier Messiaen, Pierre Boulez, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Building on Schoenberg's 12-tone method, it went even further by strictly organizing not only the pitches but also rhythm, dynamics, and timbre. The goal was music that was completely new and cut off any connection to tradition. Stockhausen spoke of a zero hour for music, a new beginning after the catastrophe of the war. At the same time, jazz finally asserted itself as a global art form after the war. Bebop, represented by musicians such as Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, gave rise to a new, complex form of jazz that was less danceable but harmonically and rhythmically highly developed. Jazz became an intellectual music that was enthusiastically received in Europe and influenced many composers. In the USA, film music also developed into a central art form of the post-war period. Composers such as Erich Wolfgang Korngold, an immigrant from Europe, created symphonic soundscapes for Hollywood that shaped the image that many people around the world had of classical music. Classical music reflected the contrast between tradition and avant-garde. While some relied on radical innovations, others stuck to tonal music but with new means of expression. Benjamin Britten, for example, composed works such as the War Requiem, which impressively captured the horrors of war in music. Dmitri Shostakovich in the Soviet Union also wrote symphonies that fluctuated between official adaptation and hidden criticism, but were always deeply influenced by the experiences of the war. The post-war period was also marked by an internationalization of music. Festivals such as the Darmstadt Summer Courses became centers of the avant-garde, where composers from all over the world came together to develop new ideas. At the same time, music and musicians became accessible to a global audience through records, radio, and soon television. Thus, music in the age of the Second World War and the post-war period was characterized by deep contrasts, by propaganda and resistance, by destruction and new beginnings, by tradition and radical renewal. It reflected the catastrophe of the war, but also the hope for a new beginning. From the ashes of the past, a diversity emerged that still shapes the face of music today. Chapter 18. The Avant-Garde and Experimental Music of the 20th Century. The second half of the 20th century was a time of radical innovations in music. After the Second World War, there was a climate of new beginnings and the search for completely new forms of expression. Many composers were convinced that traditional music had been exhausted and that it was time to renew musical thinking from the ground up. This gave rise to the avant-garde, a movement that was characterized by a love of experimentation, crossing boundaries, and often provocations. One starting point was serial music, which was based on the ideas of Arnold Schoenberg. While Schoenberg had developed the 12-tone technique to overcome tonality, composers such as Pierre Boulez, Karlheinz Stockhausen, and Luigi Nono went even further. They tried to organize not only the pitches, but also rhythm, dynamics, articulation, and even timbres in series. This total organization led to highly complex structures that were difficult for many listeners to access, but had the ambition to create a completely new musical language. Works such as Boulez's structures or Stockhausen's Kontrapunktpunkte are examples of this phase. At the same time, electronic music emerged. New technical developments such as tape recorders, synthesizers, and computers opened up worlds of sound that were previously unimaginable. In studios in Cologne, Paris, and later in the USA, composers experimented with synthetic sounds, alienated noises, and the manipulation of recordings. Stockhausen was a pioneer of this movement and created works such as Gesang der Junglinge, 1956, which merged human voices with electronically generated sounds. Another strand of the avant-garde was aleatorics, i.e., the inclusion of chants in music. The American composer John Cage is considered a central figure here. In his famous work, 433, 1952, the pianist does not play a single note for the entire duration. Instead, the audience is invited to understand the sounds of the room as music. Cage thus posed the basic question, what is music anymore? His experiments with chants, silence, and everyday sounds broke the traditional ideas and radically expanded the concept of music. But the avant-garde was not only a European phenomenon. In the USA, minimal music emerged, which deliberately set an antithesis to complex serial music. Composers such as Steve Reich, Philip Glass, or Terry Riley developed pieces based on simple patterns, repetitions, and slow changes. Works such as Reich's Music for 18 Musicians or Glass's opera Einstein on the Beach are characterized by hypnotic rhythms and clear structures that are both modern and immediately accessible. Experimental music was also evident in the inclusion of new sound sources. Composers used everyday objects, sounds of nature, or electronic effects as musical material. Instruments were played in an unconventional way. Pianists struck directly on the strings of their instrument. Violinists rubbed the strings with unusual objects. Sound became an open resource. Everything could be music. The avant-garde was also closely linked to social movements. Many composers understood their music as an expression of political and social criticism. Luigi Nono, for example, wrote works that explicitly dealt with anti-fascist and revolutionary themes. In the USA, musicians such as George Crumb combined spiritual and political themes with experimental sounds. Another feature of the second half of the 20th century was the dissolution of the boundaries between musical genres. Jazz musicians such as Miles Davis experimented with electronic sounds and absorbed influences from rock music. Classical composers, on the other hand, were inspired by jazz, rock, or pop. The strict separation between serious and entertaining music began to dissolve, and a pluralistic musical life emerged. Experimental music often presented the audience with challenges. Many works were difficult to understand, provoked rejection, or triggered scandals. But that was precisely her claim. She wanted to break up listening habits and expand perception. The question, "Is this still music?" became a central theme that shaped the discussions of the post-war period. Despite all the extremes, the avant-garde has had a lasting influence on music history. It has expanded the concept of music, opened up new technical possibilities, and created the basis for many contemporary developments, from electronic club music to sound art in museums. The second half of the 20th century was therefore a time of the most radical experiments, which broke the boundaries of what was musically imaginable. From serial austerity and electronic sounds to minimalistic clarity and random structures, the avant-garde reflected the diversity and upheaval of an era in search of new forms of expression after the war. Chapter 19: Pop, Rock, and the Global Music Culture of the 20th Century. While classical music in the 20th century was increasingly characterized by avant-garde, experimentation, and academic discourse, a music developed at the same time that reached billions of people worldwide: pop and rock music. It became the defining soundtrack of the century, influencing generations, shaping lifestyles, and contributing to the emergence of a global musical culture. The roots of this development lie in the blues and rhythm and blues of African American musicians in the USA. The blues, with its simple harmonies and heartfelt lyrics, was an expression of suffering, longing, and resilience. In the 1950s, it developed into rock and roll, which seized the youth with its energy and rebellion. Musicians such as Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, or Little Richard brought music to the stage that combined rhythm, danceability, and youthful turmoil. In the 1960s, rock music became a global phenomenon. The Beatles from Liverpool conquered the world with catchy melodies, charismatic appearance, and innovative songwriting. Their evolution from simple pop songs to experimental albums such as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band made them pioneers of music that combined pop and art. At the same time, the Rolling Stones shaped the image of the rebellious rock star with their raw sound and stage presence. The 1960s and 70s were also the time of political music. Rock became the voice of the youth movements, the protests against the Vietnam War, and the demands for more freedom and equality. Artists such as Bob Dylan combined folk and rock with poetic lyrics full of socially critical messages. Festivals such as Woodstock in 1969 became symbols of a counterculture in which music, politics, and lifestyle were inextricably linked. In the 1970s, rock music diversified further. Progressive rock with bands like Pink Floyd, Yes, or Genesis experimented with long forms, concept albums, and elaborate stage shows. Hard rock and later heavy metal, represented by bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, or Black Sabbath, relied on distorted guitars, powerful rhythms, and a new intensity. At the same time, punk spawned a backlash. Bands like the Sex Pistols or The Clash returned to simple structures, aggressive energy, and socially critical lyrics. At the same time, pop music developed in the narrower sense. With artists such as Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince, she achieved worldwide popularity in the 1980s. MTV, the first music television, made music videos a central medium of pop culture. Hits were not only broadcast on the radio, but also through visual stagings. Pop stars became global icons whose influence went far beyond music. They shaped fashion, dance, and social trends. Another decisive development was the emergence of hip-hop. Born in the Bronx in the 1970s, he combined rap, DJing, breakdancing, and graffiti to create a comprehensive youth culture. Rappers such as Grandmaster Flash, later Public Enemy, Tupac Shakur, or Notorious B.I.G. expressed social realities with their lyrics, from poverty, violence, and discrimination to self-confidence and empowerment. Hip-hop emerged as the dominant global music genre in the 1990s and 2000s, influencing almost every other genre. Electronic music has also gained in importance since the 1980s. Technological innovations such as synthesizers, drum computers, and digital production methods made completely new worlds of sound possible. Genres such as techno, house, trance, or drum and bass emerged and became the formative experience of a young generation, especially in clubs and at festivals. Electronic music relied on rhythmic intensity, endless repetition, and a collective ecstasy that focused on dance. A central feature of pop and rock music of the 20th century was its global impact. Through records, radio, television, and later the internet, songs spread around the world at lightning speed. Music became a global market in which stars in New York, London, or Los Angeles were also celebrated in Tokyo, Berlin, or Sao Paulo within a few days. This led to a new form of cultural homogenization, but also to a creative mix. Local traditions combined with global currents, for example, K-pop in South Korea or reggae in Jamaica. Pop and rock music also changed the understanding of musicians' roles. The star became the central figure, whose personality and lifestyle were just as important as his music. At the same time, a fan and youth culture developed in which music created identity, created belonging, and expressed feelings about life. The global musical culture of the 20th century was characterized by a constant dynamic between commerce and art, between mainstream and subculture, between conformity and rebellion. Pop and rock became the soundtrack of modernity. They accompanied political movements, social upheavals, technological developments, and personal life stories. Thus, the pop and rock music of the 20th century marks not only a musical epoch, but also a cultural phenomenon that changed the world. It gave rise to a new form of globalization, in which music became a universal language that connects people across borders, and at the same time, the stage for conflicts, identities, and dreams of an entire epoch.
Chapter 20. Music in the 21st Century. Digitalization, Globalization, Diversity. With the beginning of the 21st century, music entered a phase that is more strongly characterized by technology, global networking, and cultural diversity than any previous epoch. Digitization fundamentally changed the production, distribution, and reception of music. At the same time, globalization opened up new horizons by allowing music from a wide variety of cultures to enter into dialogue with each other. The music of the 21st century is characterized by plurality. Instead of a dominant style or a unifying current, countless genres, scenes, and forms of expression exist side by side. Probably the biggest upheaval was brought about by the digital revolution. With the spread of the internet, MP3 formats, and later streaming platforms such as Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube, musical life changed radically. In the past, records, cassettes, and CDs were the central carriers. Today, it is digital files that are available worldwide in seconds. For listeners, this means unprecedented accessibility. Almost the entire history of music is at hand in the smartphone. For artists, the opportunity opened up to publish their works independently of major labels and to reach an audience directly. But digitization also brought new problems. Illegal downloads in the early 2000s led to massive drops in sales in the music industry. Traditional business models collapsed, and it was only through streaming that a new system was established, but it remains highly controversial, as artists often receive only a small amount of revenue per stream. Music has been dematerialized in a certain way. Less a physical product, more a fleeting, readily available consumer item. At the same time, production methods changed. Digital audio workstations, virtual instruments, and software made it possible to produce music with a laptop in the bedroom, which can compete with professional studios in quality. Genres such as hip-hop, electronic dance music, or trap would not have been conceivable without this technology. The democratization of the means of production led to an explosion of music releases. Hundreds of thousands of new songs are released worldwide every day. Musically, the 21st century is characterized by genre diversity. Pop continues to dominate the charts, but today it is a melting pot of the most diverse influences. Artists such as Beyoncé, Taylor Swift, or Ed Sheeran combine pop with R&B, country, or electronic elements. Hip-hop finally developed into the global dominant culture.
Rappers such as Kendrick Lamar, Drake, or Cardi B shape the musical and cultural landscape. Their lyrics reflect social issues from identity to inequality. Electronic music reached millions of audiences through festivals such as Tomorrowland or the Love Parade. DJs like David Guetta, Tiesto, or Calvin Harris became superstars, filling entire stadiums with electronic beats. Subgenres such as dubstep, trap, or lo-fi hip-hop show the enormous variety of electronic forms of expression. One outstanding development is the globalization of music. Genres that used to be locally restricted became international successes. Reggaeton from Latin America, with stars like Daddy Yankee or Bad Bunny, dominates the worldwide charts. K-pop from South Korea, with bands like BTS or Blackpink, has become a global mass phenomenon that unites millions of fans on all continents. African styles such as Afrobeats find their way into international pop music, carried by artists such as Burna Boy or Wizkid. Classical music has also remained alive in the 21st century, although it no longer plays the central role it did in earlier centuries. New composers such as Thomas Adès and Unsuk Chin are experimenting with forms, electronics, and interdisciplinary approaches. Orchestras and opera houses are opening up to contemporary topics and looking for new ways to reach young audiences, often through collaborations with media art or innovative performance concepts. A defining feature of our time is hybridization. Genres interpenetrate, boundaries blur. Rap is associated with rock, classical music with electronics, jazz with hip-hop. Collaborations between artists from different scenes have become commonplace, reflecting a world that is increasingly interconnected. In addition, social media play a crucial role. Platforms such as TikTok or Instagram are not only places of exchange, but also crucial tools for the success of songs. A viral clip can turn unknown musicians into stars overnight. Today, music is no longer just an acoustic experience, but a multimedia product that is linked to images, dance trends, and memes. The 21st century also brought new debates about identity and representation in music. Questions of gender, origin, cultural appropriation, and diversity shape the discussions. Female artists, queer musicians, and voices from marginalized communities are taking up more space today and changing the musical landscape permanently. Thus, music in the 21st century shows a picture of tremendous diversity and dynamics. There is no longer one dominant style, but a multitude of parallel currents. Digitization and globalization have fundamentally changed the conditions. Music is omnipresent, limitlessly available, and has become part of a global culture. At the same time, it remains an expression of identity, emotion, and community, whether in an intimate song, a gigantic festival, or a viral social media trend. This ends the journey through music history, from the first drums of prehistoric times to the digital sound worlds of the present. The music of the 21st century shows that human creativity is inexhaustible, and that music continues to be what it has always been, a universal language that connects, inspires, and moves people.